Now we'll look at the expansion of the United States. Our learning objectives here are to summarize the changes in the United States between 1814 and 1914. And the first thing we'll look at is territorial expansion. From its earliest years, the U.S. had followed a policy of expansionism, or extending the nation's boundaries. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory and virtually doubled the size of the nation. Now, this purchase happened in conjunction with Napoleon Bonaparte. As Napoleon was in the midst of his campaigns, Napoleon needed money to finance these military campaigns. And so here was this very large chunk of land that virtually wasn't really being used. And so he agreed to sell it to the United States for $15 million. And like I said, for the United States, this really proved to be a bargain. We gained this whole new territory. Then also, after virtually doubling the size with the Louisiana Purchase, we continued to add new areas. By 1846, the U.S. had added Florida, Oregon, and the Republic of Texas. The Mexican-American War, which started in 1846 and ended in 1848, added California and the rest of the Southwest. And this brings us now to the concept of manifest destiny. Hundreds of thousands of Americans moved west in the 1840s and 1850s. Some Americans believed in manifest destiny, which was the belief that it was America's God-given right to settle land all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Some expansionists wanted to absorb Canada and Mexico. In 1867, it bought Alaska from Russia and annexed the Hawaiian Islands in 1898. Now we'll look at the Abolition Movement. Life for slaves in the South was particularly harsh. By 1860, there had been about 200 slave uprisings. Nat Turner led the deadliest revolt, killing dozens of whites. In the North, abolition societies began. Harriet Tubman was a famous leader of the Underground Railroad, a network of escape routes to help slaves escape to freedom in the North. Frederick Douglass, a former slave, became an important speaker, writer, and reformer. Women did not enjoy the same rights as men. During this era, the women's rights movement started. In 1848, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention in the United States. Mott and Stanton were also abolitionists, or those who wanted to end slavery. Abolitionist John Brown, hoping to start a slave revolt, launched an attack on the U.S. arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He captured the arsenal, but failed to spark a revolt. U.S. Marines overtook the arsenal and captured Brown and his followers. He was charged with treason against Virginia and was executed. Many Northerners viewed him as a hero. Now we're going to look at Abraham Lincoln's rise to the presidency. Lincoln was born in Kentucky in 1809, and he later moved to Illinois. As a young man, he took a job on a riverboat, delivering produce from Indiana to New Orleans. It was here that he first witnessed a slave auction, and he was appalled. In 1834, he was elected to the state legislature of Illinois. In 1846, he was elected to Congress, but he resigned in 1849 to practice law. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he decided to return to politics, and he organized the Illinois Republican Party and decided to run against Stephen Douglas for his seat in the Senate. Now this brings us to the election of 1860. So in 1860, after Lincoln has received a great deal of exposure thanks to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln runs for the presidency and wins the Republican nomination. The Democrats divided. The Northern and Southern Democrats couldn't agree. The Northern Democrats ran Stephen Douglas, while the Southern Democrats ran John C. Breckinridge. The split in the Democratic Party allowed the Republican candidate Lincoln to win the election. Northerners controlled both houses of Congress, and the Union now had an anti-slavery president. So this leads us to the really the breakup of our Union. After John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Southerners were fearful of a Southern uprising. And while Republicans denounced the raid, many Southerners blamed the Republicans because they were opposed to slavery. The South saw Lincoln's election as a victory for the abolitionists. And so South Carolina was the first state to secede, or leave the Union. And by February of 1861, 6 more Southern states voted to secede. Soon the North and South were at war. The South had fewer resources and people and less industry than the North. Still, they fought fiercely to defend their cause. The Confederacy finally surrendered in 1865. The war cost more than 600,000 lives, the largest casualty figure in any American war. In fact, roughly, it accounts for just under half of the total lives lost from the American Revolution all the way through our current conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. During the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, freeing all slaves in states that are still in rebellion after January 1st of 1863. Now, of course, by definition, Lincoln didn't control those states, so it really didn't truly free anybody. But it turned the war into a war to end slavery, and it deterred Britain and France from entering the war as they were opposed to slavery. After the war, the 15th Amendment granted African Americans the vote. Still, African Americans faced many challenges. In the South, state laws imposed segregation, or legal separation of the races in hospitals, schools, and other public places. Other state laws imposed conditions of voter eligibility that, despite the 15th Amendment, prevented African Americans from voting. And now we're going to begin looking at a group that can be referred to either as the captains of industry or the robber barons. And it really depends upon your perspective. These men amassed great wealth, and they did so by advancing industry in the United States. So in this period after the Civil War, leading up to the turn of the century, many of these captains of industry made great wealth, but many people also came to see them as robber barons, feeling that they had exploited, in many cases, their workers or the public in the process of getting wealthy. One of these individuals was Cornelius Vanderbilt, and he amassed great wealth through his railroads, making the Vanderbilts one of the richest families in the United States. Another was John D. Rockefeller. As the owner of Standard Oil, Rockefeller amassed great wealth from oil. He used vertical integration by buying companies that were suppliers and horizontal integration by buying competitors to form a near monopoly of the oil industry in America. By 1875, Standard Oil refined half of all the oil that was refined in the U.S. Another one of these so-called robber barons or captains of industry was Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie made his fortune in the booming steel industry of the Gilded Age, and he became a self-made millionaire. And he sold Carnegie Steel in 1901 for $480 million to J.P. Morgan. And that brings us, of course, to J.P. Morgan, or John Pierpont Morgan, the man who bought Carnegie Steel from Andrew Carnegie. He was a financier, or one who invests in or lends large sums of money to fund business ventures. By the time that he purchased Carnegie Steel in 1901, he was already one of the wealthiest men in the world. And another one of these men was George Pullman. George Pullman made his fortune by creating sleeping cars for trains. He is also known for violently suppressing striking workers in the town that he created, Pullman, which later became a neighborhood in Chicago. By 1890, 75% of the nation's wealth belonged to only 10% of the population. Congress responded by passing the Sherman Antitrust Act, making many types of businesses that are designed to reduce competition illegal. Many workers worked 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, working for low wages. Many of them were children. Some workers began to organize and form unions. One of the first successful unions was the Knights of Labor. The first major rail strike was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. It turned violent and resulted in many deaths. It was put down by state militias and federal troops. The Grange. In the late 1800s, farmers faced numerous problems, from falling crop prices to rising cost. Railroads were getting rich, but farmers could not afford the high shipping rates. Sometimes they had to pay as much to ship a product as they could sell it for. So the National Grange of the Order of Patrons of Husbandry, or simply the Grange, was started as a fraternal order for farmers. So in other words, it was more designed to be a social club for farmers. But as the farmers began to gather and they began to discuss their problems, they began to see that they could have power if they organized. And so membership exploded in the mid-1870s, and the organization became politically active. They pushed hard for government regulation of the railroads. Another group of farmers, the Farmers Alliance, thought that they could get more money for their crops if the money supply increased. In 1873, the dollar was placed on the gold standard, meaning that U.S. dollars were redeemable from the U.S. Treasury for gold only. This limited the amount of money in circulation. You could only have as much money as you had the gold to back it. This group wanted our dollar to be based on silver, which would increase the money supply. Alliance members eventually formed the People's Party, more commonly known as the Populist Party. This political party pushed for bank regulation, government ownership of the railroads, and the free coinage of silver. The Populist Party ran William Jennings Bryan for president in 1896 after his Cross of Gold speech won him populist support, but he lost to William McKinley, who really became the first presidential candidate to pick up the backing of big business, who helped to finance his campaign. In the late 1800s, a reform movement known as progressivism arose to address many of the social problems created by industrialization. Progressives set out to improve the living conditions of the urban poor, challenge the power and practices of big business, and to call for the government to be more honest and responsive to people's needs. Progressives also focused on granting women the vote. Women finally won the vote when the 19th Amendment went into effect in 1920.